2020 continuance of the Seattle Waterfront LID assessment hearing. Today and tomorrow, June 19th, we will hear a presentation of the city's case. Before we start with the city's presentation, I have some opening remarks regarding how we proceed over the next 2 days. The only remaining portions of the hearing are for the city to present its case and participating objectors to cross-examine city witnesses. All objectors completed presentation of their cases in chief starting February 4th through mid-April, and that portion of the hearing is concluded with no additional opportunity for objectors to present evidence or argument as part of their case in chief. The city and objectors planning to cross-examine the city's witnesses will participate today and tomorrow directly in the hearing. The city and objectors planning to cross-examine the city's witnesses have been sent an electronic invitation for participation via Zoom. Other objectors and the public may listen to the hearing via a listening line that is established with information on how to access that on the website for the Office of Hearing Examiner. That's www.seattle.gov/hearing-examiner. Callers will be able to listen to the hearing, but will not be participants in the hearing for any purpose. Seattle Channel will be broadcasting the hearing for June 18th and 19th live. Location for Seattle Channel for viewing can be located at seattlechannel.org/live or www.youtube.com/seattlechannel21/live. Seattle Channel will post recordings of the hearing within 24 to 48 hours subsequent to the date of the hearing. For all practical purposes, this hearing should be treated as an in-person hearing in accordance with the Seattle Municipal Code and Hearing Examiner Rules and Practices for Procedure. This includes each participant conducting themselves with the decorum, respect owed to each other, and the hearing forum for an in-person hearing. And I mention that mainly because sometimes we get a little used to being in our offices or our living rooms listening, and that's not where you're at. You're in an in-person quasi-judicial hearing. Our schedule today and tomorrow, we start at 9 and we go till 5. We'll take a 15-minute break at 10 a.m. We'll take lunch at noon and conclude that at 1:15 and return at 1:15. We'll take another 15-minute break at 3 p.m. Commenting on some of the aspects of being in a remote hearing, I understand that it's inevitable that remote hearings will encounter limitations concerning technology. All parties are urged to be patient with regard to the technology and other difficulties, and maybe other difficulties we experience. I've had a hearing, do need to comment that hearing conducted in person is no panacea for efficiency. I've had to address hearings with failing on-site recording equipment and speaker equipment, individuals outside the hearing disrupting us, missing witnesses, coughing fits, spilled water and coffee. So those of you who are concerned about a remote hearing being inefficient, please don't think that simply because you have been in a remote hearing that an in-person is going to be any better. We will proceed by conducting the hearing to the best of our ability, and I do appreciate your efforts to ensure the best procedural outcome possible. If in the determination of the hearing examiner, the technology supporting the hearing is not performing adequately, the examiner may suspend or continue the hearing or a portion of that. I may arrange for arguments for submission of materials or testimony at a later date, or make other necessary arrangements. All of you were sent participation guidelines that have been protocols that have been adopted by the examiner. I'll be going over those briefly. For participation, keep in mind this is a recorded proceeding. In order to get a clear recording of the record, it is important that only one person speak at a time and that you speak clearly. Participants are not actively presenting testimony or argument. For example, if you're waiting to appear as a witness, or if you're simply an observer and not engaged immediately in cross-examination, you should mute your own microphone and shut off your video feed to limit the impact on the load we're having with our technology. There's no need for me to see everybody unless I need to see you as a counsel or a witness. Every effort should be made to isolate yourself from background noises in the home or office environment from which you are broadcasting. Please make sure all cell phones are off and not in use during the hearing. Keep your eyes on the video screen if you're media engaged. Pay attention to other participants in the meeting. If the speaker's audio is disrupted, please signal the speaker with a raised hand, signaling that they should stop. If you're speaking and see the signal to stop, stop speaking until your audio is reestablished. I may not always have my eyes on you. Sometimes I have to look at the record over here, and I know some of you have to look off to the side, but please try to keep your eyes on the screen if you can, particularly if you're speaking. I notice some speakers just sort of, they're thinking in their head and they'll look off to the side. Keep your eyes on the screen, because if you're not being heard, you need to know that people are telling you can't be heard. The hearing examiner will mute, and I hope not, but may ultimately remove any participant not able to follow these protocols and or introduces unacceptable levels of intrusion of noise or speech. If you have technical or general procedural questions that do not require attention from the hearing examiner, participants may submit these to the legal assistant via the chat option during the hearing. Please do not use the chat feature for any other purpose. It is not there for participants to carry on side discussions with each other. The chat is just as much a part of the official record as any other part, so please do not use that to talk amongst yourselves. If necessary, email each other, text each other, but the chat here is for procedural issues, technical issues that you need to address to the legal assistant. For the cross-examiners, objectors, end users technology, if you're an objector and you're here to cross-examine, going to be participating in the cross-examination next week, and that's why you're participating. If you're removed from direct Zoom participation, try to connect again. If this continues to be the case, though, then try calling in on the public line that I've identified on the hearing examiner website. Also consider viewing the Seattle channel and or view the hearing recording after the fact. We simply can't accommodate everybody's end user technology. Our system hopefully will work well, but I know that we've got a lot of people on board and some are not participating as much as others. And you will have an opportunity to see what's going on. And I'm more worried about your direct participation next week than I am today. For witnesses, each witness should be called by name to appear by the appropriate representative. Before testifying, each witness will be asked by the hearing examiner to state and spell their name for the record. They must take an oath or affirmation to tell the truth. In providing testimony, a witness should enunciate and speak clearly. It may be necessary to slow the cadence of your presentation to ensure that you can be heard. Please keep your eyes on the camera as you speak so that you can be aware of whether your comments are reaching other recipients. Whether an objection is raised or some other issue arising requires you to stop or clarify testimony. If a witness's audio is disrupted during your testimony, you'll be signaled by the other participants. Please stop speaking if you see this. When the connection is resumed, you may be asked to repeat some of your statement if it was not conveyed to the hearing in the recording. A couple other items I want to address before we go forward, and that's objections. This is a unique forum with the remote technology, and we don't want to overload it. And because we really can't have a lot of people speaking at a time, we had a pre-hearing conference with many of the cross-examining objectors. And in that, I asked that due to the limitations we have, that objections, I don't want to shut off objectors from being able to make objections, because there could be something that arises that is absolutely necessary during the hearing that you raise an objection. But I really ask that anyone who's going to raise an objection to the proceedings or something that's being introduced, that you consider whether it's absolutely necessary at this time, whether it has to be introduced, whether you have to raise that objection at this time. I remind you that objections that are not raised during the city's presentation, I've offered you the ability to preserve that objection by identifying them in your closing brief, which will be due July 7th. I suggest making a note of the nature objection, the time of day as it rises during the hearing, and then including that in your closing argument. So for an objection that may not be absolutely necessary today, I still want you to preserve it, put it in your closing argument. But you don't necessarily need to interrupt every time you think you want to object on a basis of relevance or something along those lines that's simply going to interrupt the flow of our presentation today. The parties are also reminded that it is an administrative hearing resulting in a recommendation only, and that some objections are likely, frankly, inappropriate in this setting. For example, hearsay evidence is generally allowed here. So raising a hearsay objection just a waste of time. I'm going to let it in. Most of the objectors, you've all been through this already. You were allowed to load the record with just about anything you wanted to put in as part of that generous open door policy. Same is going to be for the city. So don't waste our time objecting to everything because you want to make sure that you can fight getting stuff in. I'll start shutting you down if that's where we go. Same as relevance. Most of this is relevance objections usually goes to the question of weight. And so if it's question of weight, I get it. Maybe it's not that heavy of an argument. Raise that in your closing argument. Say this piece of evidence doesn't really mean anything. Tell me then. Your objection isn't going to be helpful in today. But again, if there's an absolute need to raise an objection, I'm allowing that to proceed today so that we can actually still function with some level of normalcy to our normal hearing conduct. If anybody really just can't play by the rules with that, I may have to remove that later, but we'll just see how it proceeds. For raising an objection, make sure that you state the objection clearly and accompany your verbal objection. Don't just say objection. Raise your hand so that I know that I can see you, as well as stating it, and state the basis. Sometimes I've got representatives that just say objection. Well, what's your basis for that? I need to know it so that I can rule on it. And likewise, opposing counsel should be prepared to respond to the objection. Don't just keep going forward and make me have to stop you. If an objection is raised, I'll give you the opportunity to respond to it. In fact, I expect it. Witnesses, if you're speaking and an objection is raised, stop speaking immediately. Do not respond to a question when an objection has been raised. You will be signaled when or if it's okay for you to proceed. As far as exhibits, we're in a unique situation here that's unique to this hearing and how we're handling it. The city has submitted in advance electronic copies of exhibits we'll introduce at the hearing. And hopefully everyone's received those. And I'll be turning it over, getting an opportunity to ask questions here in just a moment, but I assume that those have been distributed. Additional exhibits may be produced in the hearing if necessary, but if that happens, it has to be emailed to everybody. I may allow some screen sharing of exhibits, but my assumption is that everybody has copies. And again, so we don't overload the system by putting everything up for everyone to see. I know it's convenient for everyone, but I expect you to be managing the exhibits you receive. Now, if you haven't received them, that's a different issue, and we can address that if it comes. But occasionally we may do some screen sharing, but we're not going to require the city to post everything that they're using, or if there's some other reason that we're looking at an exhibit. I've had a couple questions that came up from objectors in advance. One was in how to reference exhibits. I assume this is more for next week in closing arguments, and whether there's a requirement that in referencing exhibits, whether you reference existing exhibit numbers. The process we've been using is each case number has a list of numbers under it, or each consolidated group of cases. For example, Perkins Coie is a set of case numbers, and they have a single list of exhibits 1 through X. The preference is to identify those exhibits back. If it's possible to reference back to an exhibit number and a case number, I ask that you do that. However, I recognize that this record is already replete with duplicates. Many objectors submitted the same exhibits. So referencing all of them or trying to find the right one is a fool's errand. There's also, we've come across an issue with some organization of the files, I think due to the pandemic. Usually we work fully within our silo of the hearing examiner's office and manage the record. But in this case, there was some intake of documents by FAS and or the clerk's office. And I believe there was a period where documents were coming in and they were posted. All of the whole record is posted on our website. But I've noticed that we did notice that some of the objections and exhibits came in out of order. And it looked like they were just getting posted. It'd be very difficult to find your way through it. So I'm not going to ask you to go back and find your way through that. We are cleaning that up, and I believe we'll have the whole record posted in an easier order to reference and use for your closing briefs by the end of this week or the beginning of next week. But that's just another reason I highlight the ultimate decision is that do your best to refer back if you can, but I recognize that some duplicates will come in. And for this next section, where we have the city presentation, and then next week we have cross-examination, the exhibit numbers will simply proceed from the city's exhibits that we have today, 1 through, can't remember the final number that they've got. And if there are new exhibits that we don't have a reference back number to another case, we'll simply pick up the city section, because even cross-examination is part of the city's case. And so those numbers will proceed. We'll just give it a new number. And for those of you hearing the challenge of this system, please know that in addition to cleaning up the record before you get into your closing arguments for this last segment, I look to sort of a catch-all to organize this thing, is we will be date stamping the entire record. And I believe that'll probably be the most consistent line of organization throughout the record. There was one request for, there's been actually 2 motions for inclusion, meaning the reference to other cases and trying to incorporate those. I'm granting the 2 that have been at request. One was from Mr. Moses, one was from Perkins Coie and their clients that they're representing. I grant those requests. Those motions were not actually necessary in how I'm approaching inclusion. You've already made incorporated by reference, either in the case of Perkins Coie and their representation, they did that orally in a hearing, and then Mr. Moses had preserved reference by 2 other cases in his original objection, and has also been participating in the hearing. I will note that there are some of those adoption by inclusion that I may have to look askance at as we get further into it. There were some objectors that were, I don't know if they were told by someone else to do this, or they were sophisticated enough on their own to submit an objection and then say, I incorporate everything else from everybody else. They have submitted no evidence. They've not done anything to pursue their case. And whether a simple line to reference everybody else and make that their case or not is an upper question for me at this time. But there's no way to fix that at this point anyway. So you don't need to send a motion for inclusion if you've been pursuing your case. We already know you've got that. Lastly, Mr. William Patrick, for case number 352, requested to allow David Jacobs to do the questioning asked for during the cross-examination on his behalf. So essentially appointing a representative for him. And that's fine. You can appoint any representative you want at any course in this matter. We're pretty loose about that in the hearing examiner's office. If you have somebody else you want to do it, recognizing that in the cross-examination period, you're all part of a single group for purposes of the record that arises during cross-examination. And so again, if one party asks the question, you don't have to repeat it. You get to reference in your closing and or any responsive documents, the responses raised in response to other people's questions. That way, you don't have to ask the same question over and over. In fact, I anticipate that as you organize yourselves, there will be a group that leads the questioning. I wouldn't be surprised. I'm just guessing that might start with some attorneys when they get started. I'm guessing I wouldn't be surprised if the first few questioners get through about 70% of the questions that are going to be asked of any witness. And then some of you may have additional questions, but I don't expect the same question to be asked repeatedly to get the same answer. We will stop that if it starts to occur in cross-examination, but we can get to that next week. I just wanted to be responsive to your immediate request. Those are my opening remarks to get us guided today in response to the questions I've had so far. I will ask if there are any questions about procedure at this time, from any general questions about procedure regarding the city's presentation over the next 2 days that any party has at this time before we start. Are there any questions, general questions about the next 2 days?
Hearing Examiner Vansel, we did not receive any of the city's exhibits yesterday or this morning. I'm just wondering, did we miss something, or were they not sent out?
I'll have to ask the city what it did with its process. Mr. Filippini, are you speaking as primary on behalf of the city today?
I am, yes. We submitted, pursuant to the order last week, we submitted everything by noon yesterday. I was our understanding to the hearing examiner's office, our understanding that they were going to be forwarded out.
All right. We'll hit our first issue then. It was our understanding orally from the pre-hearing conference that you would have collected the exchange of objectors' emails. However, we'll try to correct that right now, and we'll send them out. And I'll probably take a break so that you can all get them and make sure that that works. While that's being addressed by my legal assistant, Mr. Reuter, you have a question.
Yes, you mentioned in regard to the motion to incorporate, I also filed one of those on behalf of case 133 and others. You didn't mention it, but I understand from your comments that that motion's been granted as well.
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And if I can just speak to clarify, I think that when you said that Perkins filed a motion, I believe that was Mr. Reuter's motion and not Perkins' motion.
Yes, I referred to two motions that I received, and both of them were granted. Honestly, I'm not going to try to guess off the top of my head whether Mr. Reuter was one of those or not. But I know that, Mr. Reuter, you've been pursuing your case on behalf of your clients. Again, incorporation is something that this whole hearing is consolidated. And so the necessity for adoption by reference is limited or not even needed for those who are actually pursuing their case. I'm mostly concerned about individuals who frankly are not pursuing their case, submitted an objection, and said I adopt by incorporation everybody else's stuff and essentially letting everybody else do the work. They're not submitting any evidence about their own property, et cetera. So I hopefully you all understand that. I'm not talking, honestly, everyone on the line today is already past that mark. If you're part of the cross-examining objectors, you've been pursuing your case. That's how you got here today. So that's probably more for the benefit of anyone on the listening line who thinks, well, I threw that in there and I get to ride on everybody else's coattails to make my case. And I haven't made a final decision about that, but it's just an issue I raised for everyone's awareness about where we're at. Any other general procedural questions about before we get started? All right, hearing none, I will ask that the city give us a brief outline of how they intend to proceed with the witnesses they have today. We have about a half an hour before our first break. I told you the lunch break, so just let us know how you're intending to proceed. It would be helpful. And then I'm going to see where we're at with my legal assistant. And we may take the 10 o'clock break early so that we can make sure the exhibits are adequately distributed.
Absolutely. We have 3 witnesses that we plan to call live. Marshall Foster will go first, Mark Lukens will go second, and Robert McCauley will go third. And I would anticipate that we would get into Mr. McCauley today, but not finish his testimony, and that would carry over into tomorrow.
Okay. And for Mr. Foster, what's your anticipated time for that on direct for that witness?
For both Mr. Foster and Mr. Lukens, they both have about an hour each. Mr. Foster was a few minutes more when we practiced, and Mr. Lukens was a few minutes less.
Sure, and you're not held to minutes. This is just for a general estimate of how we'll proceed today. I know that the that's helpful to the objectors to know how we're proceeding as well. And we all know that Mr. McCauley is going to take some time.
Yes.
I'm going to pause for just a moment. We are still on the record, but my legal assistant's not here, so I can't ask him where we're at with the record. I'm going to step out and check with him to see how we're doing with that, and then I'll come back and report to you all. But please be mindful, he's in control of the recording, so you will all, this is actually still part of the, please don't speak and add things to the record while I'm away. All right, I have a report from my legal assistant that he is setting send now for all of the city exhibits. And so everyone who has, again, this is to the objectors who are participating today in anticipation they'll be participating in cross-examination. They'll may be part of the general record that's available to everyone at a later date, but we need the participating objectors to receive those. Looks like we have approximately 32 exhibits, and he's sending those now. I know if I was just receiving 30, even not a voluminous record of exhibits, but 32 exhibits, if I was just receiving that, I'd want a break so I could make sure I could access those on my computer. And so we will take instead of taking a break at 10 o'clock, we're going to take a break now, and we'll return at 9:45 to give you time to receive those and to process them on your computer. Let's say 9:50. In fact, I'll give you enough time that you can actually organize those and be ready to proceed. So the city will be on at 9:50, and hopefully the objectors will have the exhibits ready to go. Thank you. Until he's back and turns us off, also the record is still going. Yeah.
Thank you. Our first witness will be Marshall Foster. Marshall, are you? Yes, you are.
Foster, do you swear or affirm the testimony you will provide in today's hearing will be the truth?
I do.
Your witness.
Thank you. Marshall, if you could let us know, who is your employer?
The city of Seattle.
What is your current position at the city of Seattle?
I am the director of the city office of the Waterfront Civic Project.
And briefly,
I'm sorry, Mark. I'm just going to interrupt you. I'm experiencing very significant feedback here, and this did not happen in our test. I don't know. Usually, that's a result of someone not being on mute. Now it is much better. Let's try. I see one individual maybe who's not on mute on our call in the out there, but
You're coming
okay.
through.
We'll try again.
Mr. Fox, if you could tell us your educational background, please.
Sure. I have a undergraduate degree from Middlebury College, and I have a graduate degree in city and regional planning from UC Berkeley.
When did you start working for the city?
I was hired by the city in 2007. I worked as a special projects manager in what was called the Office of Policy and Management.
Okay, and what was your next job for the city?
Let's see, I moved over to the Department of Planning and Development. I was the city planning director from 2010 through 2014 and did a variety of things in that role. Worked on South Lake Union, worked on a variety of different neighborhood plans in the Rainier Valley, in Northgate, and Capitol Hill.
And when did you become the director of the Office of the Waterfront and Civic Projects, your current job?
Let's see, I transitioned at the very end of 2014 in December.
All right. When was the Office of the Waterfront formed?
It was formed when Mayor Murray came into office in I believe that was early 2014.
And what is the purpose of the Office of the Waterfront?
The Office of the Waterfront was really created at that time to take on a lot of work had been done across different city departments with the community to develop the vision for what we now call Waterfront Seattle. And the Office of the Waterfront was created really to take that work and consolidate it into one department, and then to really advance the design, engineering, community engagement, and ultimately the construction of the project under one centralized office.
And where does the Office of the Waterfront fit within the city's organizational structure?
Sure. The Office of the Waterfront is an independent office. So I report directly to Mayor Durkin. I'm part of her cabinet. And we're administratively housed within the Department of Transportation. What that means is basically we rely on them to provide our HR support, our IT support, and other administrative types of support that it wouldn't make sense for us to recreate on our own.
Okay. And what is your role as director of the office?
Sure. So my role is really focused on leading our overall vision for the waterfront, and then managing a core group of managers in that office that oversee all of our design and engineering of specific parts of the program, our construction management, which over the last year has become a major focus of our work as we're actually out in construction now, And also, I oversee all of our relationships with our elected leaders, both the mayor and the city council, and am very engaged in all of our partnerships with a lot of the organizations on the waterfront. Pike Place Market, Seattle Aquarium, Alliance for Pioneer Square, as well as all of our businesses and residents that are sort of right there on the waterfront.
And you mentioned managing a core staff. How many people work for the Office of the Waterfront?
We have 11 core FTE, so full-time equivalents. Those are city staff. We do also have consultants who are obviously not city staff, but who are co-located with us, depending on the amount of work at any given time.
Okay. I'll ask you about the Waterfront Seattle program. What is the Waterfront Seattle program?
Sure. So Waterfront Seattle is a multi-year effort. We've been working on it for over a decade now. It's really focused on, with the removal of the Alaskan Way Viaduct, which has obviously now been done, the creation of a whole host of different public infrastructure and public parks and open spaces on the footprint of where the viaduct used to be, to kind of really create public space to serve the city.
And when did the Waterfront Seattle program begin?
It started in earnest in 2009.
And what is included in the Waterfront Seattle program?
Sure, there are a whole host of capital improvements which have gone through a whole kind of planning and design process. Reconstruction of Alaskan Way, creation of a new public promenade that runs the length of the central waterfront, the reconstruction of Pier 62 and Pier 58, which is currently called Waterfront Park, on either side of the Seattle Aquarium, and then a whole host of different east-west connections to help connect our waterfront into the downtown neighborhoods adjacent. Everything from improvements in Pioneer Square to the Overlook Walk, which is an elevated connection between Pike Place Market and the waterfront.
How much is the Waterfront Seattle program expected to cost?
Everything we were just talking about in the program, about $724 million total.
And what are the funding sources for the Waterfront Seattle program?
Sure. So it's an integrated funding plan. It has a mix of different public sources as well as some private sources. We have a significant commitment from the state of Washington to replace the Alaskan Way and all of the kind of core transportation associated with that. That was part of the larger viaduct removal program at the state of Washington. We have significant funds from the city coming from a range of different sources, commercial parking tax, real estate excise tax, as well as the Metropolitan Park District, some of the park features. Obviously, we have the local improvement district, and we have a significant private philanthropic campaign, all of which together bring together that $724 million program.
When is the Waterfront Seattle program expected to be complete?
We expect to finish the construction in 2024.
And is 2024 a deadline?
No, it's not. That's really, if you look at our construction sequencing, that's when we anticipate being finished.
All right, I'd like to ask you some questions about the Waterfront LID. Is the Waterfront LID part of the Waterfront Seattle program?
Yes, it is.
And I guess let me ask more basically, what is the Waterfront LID?
Sure. So the Waterfront LID is like other LIDs in the state of Washington, a funding mechanism that assesses properties that are benefited by an improvement to help actually finance that improvement. In the case of the Waterfront Seattle program, we have 6 individual elements which are partially funded by the LID.
And what portion of of the special benefit that the properties have been assessed, what portion will property owners be charged as part of the LID?
So they will be charged 39.2% of the special benefit created by the waterfront improvements.
Yeah, and why is the city charging property owners less than the full amount of the special benefit estimated by the LID?
So that was part of City Council's decision. Really, it's focused on providing the funding, going back to that integrated funding plan that we talked about, to provide the level of funding needed to support the overall program.
And how much is the LID expected to raise?
$160 million.
And how did the city arrive at $160 million?
So, couple of things. First off, through the public process, around determining the strategy with funding, there was a goal established for the LID, and then more recently with the formation of the LID, we have essentially reached a negotiation around a protest waiver agreement that confirmed the $160 million and actually capped the city's ability to assess to $160 million.
And do you know who was the protest waiver agreement negotiated with? Who's the city's counterparties?
An organization called the Waterfront Conservancy.
And do you know what percentage of the value to be assessed in the LID was represented by the Waterfront Conservancy?
I believe it was about just over 50%. I think it was about 51% of the total.
Prior to that negotiation, what had the planned size of the LID been?
It had been $200 million.
And if you know, what is the total final special benefit estimated by the city's appraiser on the Waterfront LID?
I can't give, it's just over $400 million. A little over 400.
All right, I'd like you to open Exhibit 1 if you could. You have it there.
Yeah, give me just a sec.
If I could ask you to pause, Mr. Filippini. I just want to confirm, are there any objectors that did not receive the exhibits? It's your chance to speak up and let me know if you did not receive exhibits.
This is Mr. Moses. We have received the exhibits. They came to my computer about 2 minutes ago. It's a OneNote file that requires me to get a verification code to open. It's going to require me to have 2 screens up to deal with it. So it's going to take me at least another 5 minutes just to sort through what I've been sent. And for people who don't have 2 screens to work with, it's going to be very difficult.
Thank you, Mr. Moses. Has anybody else not received the exhibits? Mr. Moses didn't receive them in the same earlier email, and I was just sent them, and so he's getting caught up to us. Does everyone else have received the exhibits?
This is Megan Lynn. I received all of the exhibits except that I'm having trouble accessing some of the Macaulay exhibits, which will come later, but I did want to flag it now since you're asking about our access to exhibits.
All right. For the moment, if I could ask Mr. Filippini if it's possible, can we share screen for the Foster exhibits? Are you able to do that from your end?
I believe we can.
Okay. Let's just do that for now. Again, I don't want to make that the norm, but we'll make an effort to do that when it's possible that the parties can't follow along.
Okay, and I will try this and we'll. Not sure that that's the screen we want to share. I go back into to stop the share and see if I could grab this.
While Mr. Filippini is looking, I just want to remind everyone that although I indicated the schedule in the morning would be that we would take a 10 o'clock break, we will not take the 10 o'clock break because we've already taken that break at 9:30, approximately 9:30, in order to accommodate the exchange of exhibits. That break concluded at 9:50. We will not take the 10 o'clock break. Our next break will be at noon.
Okay, I think this worked, at least on my end. I'm going to ask you, Mr. Foster, to look at page 15 of Exhibit C1, and all of the exhibits are numbered at the top, in the center of the top of the page, so that, and we numbered them all as C for city for the exhibits, and then the page number, so we didn't have to worry about different internal page numbers on documents. And then, of course, Marshall, it should also be up on your screen, but just let me know when you have it there.
Thank you. I do have it up.
Okay, and if you could tell us, I guess, first of all, for the record, what is Exhibit 1?
This is a list of the improvements that are partially funded by the LID.
And if you could, generally speaking, if you could identify Exhibit 1 with, this is page 15. What is Exhibit 1 in total?
In total, yeah, these are the 6 projects that are partially funded by the LID.
Okay, is Exhibit 1 a copy of City Ordinance 125760?
Oh, I'm sorry. Excuse me, I misunderstood you. Yes,
No problem.
This is the LID formation ordinance.
Okay,
and LID formation ordinance.
And I've taken you to what's marked up in the corner on the document as Exhibit A. Again, for the audience, page 15 of Exhibit C1, and I've got it screencast here.
Yep.
So my first question for you, Marshall, was what are we looking at on page 15?
We're looking at the list of projects that are partially funded by the LID.
Okay, and if you could please walk us through that for the record.
Sure. You have the public promenade, which is a continuous public open space that extends along the west side of Alaskan Way from King to Pine Streets. The Overlook Walk, which is an elevated pedestrian bridge at the terminus of the Pike Pine Corridor, which I won't read all of that, but it essentially connects Pike Place Market and the waterfront with a pedestrian connection and park features. The Pioneer Square street improvements, which are streetscape and sidewalk roadway improvements on Main, Washington, Yesler, and King Streets in Pioneer Square. The Union Street pedestrian connection, which is an accessible pedestrian bridge connecting from Western Avenue down to Alaskan Way. The Pike and Pine Street improvements, which again are pedestrian, sidewalk, and crossing improvements along both Pike and Pine Streets from First Avenue to 9th Avenue. And lastly, Waterfront Park, which you'll note we also call Pier 58, which is the reconstruction of Waterfront Park, which is a pier park at the base of Union Street to provide essentially a public space for gathering, performance, etc. on the waterfront.
And has the city formed local improvement districts before?
Yes, it definitely has.
And if you could please give us some examples of LIDs that the city has formed.
Sure. 2 that immediately come to mind: the South Lake Union Streetcar, and further back in history, the Aurora Bridge, actually.
Okay. One thing I haven't asked is how much will the waterfront LID cost?
You mean the projects in the LID?
Yes, the projects in the LID, their construction costs.
Sure. It's just shy of $350 million.
And so I asked you earlier about how the sources of funding for the broader Waterfront Seattle program. How will the projects in the 6 projects that we just went through, part of the LID, how are they being funded? what are the sources of funding?
Sure. Well, those projects are funded obviously by the LID. That's a major source of funding for those projects. It's not the only one though. They're also funded by city sources. You'll see some Metropolitan Park District funding. You'll see some other city sources like CPT and REIT. I'm sorry, I say CPT. What I mean is commercial parking tax, which is a very common source for capital projects in the city, and then private philanthropy, the philanthropic campaign that we talked about before.
And what are the sources of the philanthropic funds?
Sure, we have a partner called Friends of Waterfront Seattle, which has committed to bring forward $110 million through its own independent fundraising, specifically for Waterfront Seattle.
Mr. Filippini?
Yes.
Do you have any additional questions about Exhibit 1?
I don't. Would you like me to stop sharing?
Yeah, just put up share, if we do any share screen, just for the duration of the questioning around that item. It's easier for me to evaluate the witness and understand how things are going if I can see them full screen.
Okay, understood. And I believe you may have said this, Mr. Foster, but again, what is the commitment from Waterfront Seattle program, the dollar amount? I'm sorry, from Friends of the Waterfront.
Sure, it's 110 million total. It's actually, there was an ordinance around the same time as the formation that followed that outlines that amount.
What role did your office, the Office of the Waterfront, have in securing this philanthropic funds from Friends?
Sure. So we definitely had a central role. We've developed a partnership with that organization over many, many years of the kind of public planning and the whole process here. And we worked very closely with them on kind of developing, what was their potential to do that. Their kind of board and their ability to assess their own, ability to drive a campaign, and then ultimately also did due diligence, as the ordinance that I mentioned outlines, to kind of confirm their ability to do that. The other major part of our partnership with Friends, which is actually much, I'd say, arguably more the focus today, is on their partnership with the Parks Department on the maintenance and programming of the space. And so we're doing a lot of intensive work with them now on how they will actually partner with Parks Department on the actual operations of the waterfront.
And was the city's receipt of the philanthropic funds from Friends of the Waterfront contingent on the city creating a lid?
No, that's not as I understand it. Our work with them, they independently committed to that campaign. Our work really, the key thing, their interests have always been on the city, are that we would commit the resources and the dedicated staff necessary to maintain the park at a very high level of quality in partnership with them.
And what you mentioned resources, is there a dollar figure? And if so, what is it for the city's commitment on maintenance of the park when constructed?
Sure. So, so the city committed, as part of the ordinance I mentioned, to a minimum of 4.8 million annually for park maintenance. And as part of that, the city essentially dedicating a team who would focus on the waterfront parks and open spaces in partnership with Friends to deliver our ongoing maintenance and operations. And actually that commitment was originally outlined in the actions that form the Metropolitan Park District. So there's a longstanding commitment to provide those resources on the waterfront.
Is there a formal agreement between the city and Friends of the Waterfront for the 110 million in funding?
So the ordinance is really, that is the key place where that partnership is defined. There's no additional separate commitment or agreement separate from the ordinance.
Okay. I'm going to switch gears a bit and ask, how did the city evaluate whether and how much special benefit the LID improvements would provide?
Sure. So to do that, we hired an independent appraiser to do that, Bob McCauley with ABS valuation.
When did the city first begin contemplating an LID as a funding mechanism?
So there was a strategic plan that came out of the original community process that kind of defined the Waterfront Seattle. That was in 2012, which contemplated the idea of an LID as a funding mechanism. And that was endorsed unanimously at the city council by a resolution at that time.
And then when did the city begin working on the current Waterfront LID that's at issue in this hearing?
That was in 2016. We really went out and actually did an RFQ to bring on that independent appraiser to help us do a special benefit study.
Okay, and I take it from your testimony a moment ago that contract was awarded to ABS valuation?
That's correct.
Okay. I now would like you to go to Exhibit 2.
Okay.
And again, Mr. Filipini, if it's possible to share that exhibit, we'll just do that for each of the exhibits for Mr. Foster, and then hopefully by the time we've gotten through our first witness, the objectors will be caught up with exhibits.
Okay. And I apologize that they will be highlighted. They're just highlights for myself as I was asking questions, but it actually might help the audience track where we are in the document.
I've got it up.
Okay, and I just want to pin it for everybody. Marshall, if you could tell us what we have here.
This is a timeline for the Waterfront LID.
Okay. Timeline leading to what?
To the, well, several different things. The formation of the LID, but ultimately to the appeal and hearing process that we're in currently.
Okay. And I'm not gonna, obviously we're putting this as an exhibit into the record. I don't want you to read everything, and you probably could guess I'm gonna ask you some questions about the highlighted spots. So the first one, what happened on August 9th, 2017?
So that is when we released the initial summary memo on the LID feasibility study that ABS prepared.
And as you understand it, was the city required to complete a feasibility study prior to formation of the LID?
It is, let's see, so it's not required by state law, but you know, in our case, we thought it was an appropriate thing to do.
Okay, and that was my next question. Why? Why did you do it? But you answered that. So I'd like to direct your attention to the next highlight that I have there, and for folks at home, I'll just read that. It's May 9th, 2018, and it's a summary of Waterfront Seattle project formation special benefit / proportionate assessment study for local improvement district. Why did the city commission this study?
So, so that's essentially helps to create the preliminary assessment role, which is required under state law. And so the special benefit study essentially supports that. It also really helped recommend a boundary for the LID, you know, geographically, the area to be potentially assessed, as well as to set up, you know, a structure for how to ensure fair and proportionate allocation of the assessments out. So the tiering and the sizing of those assessments.
Okay, and I'll take you next to May 21st, 2018. And the city council unanimously passes resolution number 31812, by a vote of 8-0. Do you recall what was the subject matter of resolution 31812?
Sure, that was the city council's declaration of their intent to form the LID, which is essentially providing all the public notice and notice to property owners of its intent to consider formation.
And besides passing a public ordinance, how did the city inform affected property owners of the intent to form?
Sure. So that action also directs the city clerk to formally notify property owners, and so based on that, the city did move forward and mail letters directly to all the affected parties, informing them, I believe, both of the city's intent and also the potential amount of their assessment and their right to participate in a series of public hearings regarding the formation.
And what role did your office have in informing affected property or providing this information to property owners?
So we essentially support that whole process and supported the hearing process that followed.
Okay.
We did also, sorry, just one addition. We did have a website that we provided, not a requirement, but we essentially created a portal for property owners to be able to look up their property, find out their potential assessment, and we provided an FAQ, frequently asked questions, and other information for the public to help understand it.
Okay. When did the city mail letters to property owners regarding their preliminary assessments?
Right after the council's action, so I think it was in June of 2018.
And when did the city hold a waterfront lid formation hearing?
We held hearings in July of that year.
Okay.
And should I read those specifically?
No, is it July 13 through 31 in Exhibit 2?
Yes.
Okay. And who conducted the hearing?
The Office of the Hearing Examiner.
And what was the result of the hearing?
What was the result of the hearing? The hearing examiner basically took all the public input and feedback, compiled that, and provided the city council with those comments along with a cover letter back.
Okay. When did the city form the waterfront LID?
So the city council ultimately took the actions to form it in January of 2019, January 28th. They
Okay.
had an ordinance that was passed unanimously at the city council.
Okay. And was the Seattle Park District Board of Commissioners required to approve the LID first prior to the city council?
No, I'm not aware of any requirement that the Board of Park Commissioners consider an LID.
I'm going to take you back to Exhibit 1. I have a, so I'll unpin this document, and I will take you back to Exhibit 1, please. And this time, I'm going to take you to Exhibit C1, page 8, and I will pin it for folks to, I'll share it for folks to see. But again, it's page 8 of Exhibit C1.
Okay. Got it.
And I've highlighted some text there. Given that we're remote, I'll read it into the record, Marshall, and then I'll have some questions for you. And highlighted text, which is located in Section 3 of Ordinance 125760, which is Exhibit C1, reads as follows. The LID improvements shall be in accordance with plans and specifications prepared by the Director of the Department of Director of the OWCP on behalf of the Director of Transportation of the Seattle Department of Transportation and on file in the City Clerk's office, and may be modified by the City Council as long as such modifications do not affect the purpose of the LID improvements or constitute materially different improvements, provided, however, that changes in detail of such plans that do not significantly alter the scope or cost of the LID improvements will not require further approval. And I wound up reading the whole sentence for completeness, even though only a portion was highlighted in the exhibit. But in any event, what is your understanding of the language that I just read from Section 3 of the ordinance?
Sure. So that language basically requires that the LID improvements be built in accordance with the plans and specifications on file with the city clerk.
And what is your understanding of the what plans and specifications are referenced in Section 3?
So what's referenced are specifically the conformed plans and specifications. They're typically prepared by an outside engineering firm hired by the city. They're stamped by a PE, a professional engineer, and those are actually, that's done once we've reached 100% design and the project is ready to actually be built.
And then if you could describe for us what type of information is included in these final conformed set of plans and specifications?
Sure. So it's an enormous document. These are the very specialized kind of technical documents that essentially serve as the blueprint for every square foot of what will be built. In our case, these plans are close to a foot tall if you were looking at a physical copy of them, just to give you a sense of scale. They address everything, every detail of how not only the project will be built, but how materials will be procured, details of location, color, density, structural reinforcement of concrete, all the detailing of how we do our plantings, soil mixtures, planting sizes, drainage and utility layouts, material specifications for all of that. The other thing that the conform plans and specs address is actually how the contractor will manage the construction, how they will manage the construction site. For example, traffic mitigation requirements are a major part of what we deal with. How we will do quality assurance, QA work, inspections. They also address actually how they will do payments and invoicing, and sort of some of the basics of how they will actually operate the construction management itself, along with, there's literally thousands of technical details in those plans.
And do final conformed plans and specifications exist for any of the lid improvements at this point?
Yes. There are final conformed plans and specs for the promenade improvement, which is part of a larger contract called the Main Corridor, which also includes the reconstruction of Alaskan Way itself.
And are those plans and specs on file with the city clerk's office?
Yes.
Does Section 3 of Ordinance 125760 say when the plans and specs must be filed with the city clerk's office?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
What was the Office of the Waterfront's role, leading up to formation of the LID?
Sure. So I think we had a pretty central role. We were involved in doing public engagement, which was both to the general public, but also, very importantly, to property owners in the district, to share information regarding the LID and take input and feedback along the way.
Did your office engage in public outreach with property owners and other stakeholders leading to formation?
Yes, there was a ton of engagement that was done in a lot of different ways and in a lot of different venues. I would say we did, overall, we hosted or participated in other people's meetings, about 80 total meetings that took place in the lead up to some of those decisions. And those were, briefings that we would provide, discussion sessions, large public meetings, lots of different venues. We would go to, large organizations that were hosting meetings, of whether it was residential property owners or commercial or hotel or other groups, industry organizations, as well as a lot of in-depth, more kind of one-on-one or small group discussions. We attended dozens of HOA meetings, homeowners association meetings with individual condominium owners. And then we really tried to maintain a consistent, updated website at waterfrontseattle.org, which carried all of the core information for the public about, and for property owners about the LID proposal, as well as the specifics of the proposed assessments.
Okay. I have a few questions for you about ABS Valuation's final special benefit study. I don't have it as an exhibit, because I don't believe that we need it. What's the valuation date in the final special benefit study?
Sure. It was October 1st of 2019.
And who picked the valuation date used in the study?
My understanding is Bob, Mr. McCauley, picked that date because that was the date that he had sufficient information to be the basis for the underlying improvements in terms of the proposal, as well as to essentially to support his special benefit analysis.
Was it your office one of the sources of his information?
Yes.
Yeah. Who would have been the primary point of contact at the city with ABS valuation on the date selected in the study?
That would have been the city's Department of Finance and Administrative Services, which is known as FAS. They held the contract with ABS.
Okay. So what has been your office's role since the LID was formed in January 2019?
So since the LID was formed, our involvement has really stepped back. And in terms of, FAS, which is the city's lead agency for all of our financial management, our treasury, collections, all those activities are led by them. And so they've really taken on the leadership role in advancing the LID since the formation.
Okay, and what is your office focused on now with respect to the LID?
Sure. The Office of the Waterfront at this point is really focused on design and planning and construction of the whole program, but obviously that includes the Waterfront LID improvements. We're not directly involved in the assessments, which are the subject of the hearing today.
Okay. What I'd like to do, I think the most efficient way for us to do this is I'm going to take you back to Attachment A in Exhibit 1. That's the list of the 6 LID improvements. And then I'm going to ask you some questions, but I think it will be easiest if we have it up on the screen.
Okay.
So that was page 15, and I will share screen again for folks. All right, what I'd like to ask you about now, Marshall, is the status of environmental review for the 6 improvements. And again, I just think it's easiest if I have it here. So if you could tell me the status of environmental review for the promenade.
Sure, it was completed.
Okay, and how?
It was completed as part of the what's called the ALPAL Final Environmental Impact Statement.
And what is ALPAL? Is that an acronym?
It is an acronym, sorry.
What does it stand for?
It stands for Alaskan Way Promenade and Overlook Walk.
Okay. And when was the ALPAL Final Environmental Impact Statement issued?
It was issued in October of 2016.
And I'm going to use another acronym. I'll shorten down Final Environmental Impact Statement to FEIS. So when did work begin on the ALPAL FEIS?
In 2013.
What projects were included in the ALPAL FEIS?
The included 4 proposed waterfront projects: the main corridor, the promenade, the overlook, and east-west connections.
Was the Alpau FEIS specific to the waterfront LID?
No, it was not. It didn't focus solely on it. There are several projects included there, which at this point are receiving LID funding.
Okay. Ask you to look back at, well, I'm just going to ask you, but this is a reference for you, but what is the status of environmental review on Overlook Walk?
It was completed as part of what you just described, the Alpau final environmental impact statement.
Okay. And then what is the status of environmental review on the Pioneer Square street improvements?
Yes, Pioneer Square street improvements, there has been environmental review of those as part of that Alpau EIS, a final EIS. There is some additional review that we're doing based on some adjustments to those street improvements since that was done.
Okay. And when does the city estimate it will complete environmental review for those additional Pioneer Square street improvements?
So they have to get to a sufficient level of design to do that. We expect that'll be done by the end of this year, at the latest early 2021.
And then moving on, what is the status of environmental review on the Union Street pedestrian connection?
That was completed as part of the Alpau FEIS.
Okay. What is the status of environmental review on the Pike Pine streetscape improvements?
That has not been completed. But like I mentioned before, once it gets to a sufficient level of design, that will be done. We expect.
Yeah, when does the
I
city
think similar to what I was saying. Yeah, I think it's likely would be the end of this year, very early 21 at the latest.
What is the status of environmental review for Waterfront Park, which I understand will be called Pier 58?
Yes, so environmental review has been completed for that. The city issued a DNS for that project in February. And after, public comment, it was finalized in March of this year.
Okay, and for the record, what is a DNS?
Excuse me again, I shouldn't use so many acronyms. A determination of non-significance under SEPA, the State Environmental Policy Act.
Okay. And DNS is now final?
It is. It was finished in early March.
So as I understood your testimony, 4 of the 6 on the LID improvements were analyzed in the Alpau FEIS. Why did the city not analyze Pier 58 and the Pike Pine streetscape improvements with the Alpau FEIS?
Sure. So basically, like I was referencing before, those projects weren't at a level of design that we could meaningfully review them under SEPA. So the city, we begin environmental review of a project when we have enough information about what's proposed that we can provide, that we can do a meaningful review of that project. And those were just not at that point yet.
Okay. Are you familiar with the cumulative impacts chapter of the Alpau FEIS?
Yes.
And what relationship does that chapter have to the Union Street pier replacement or Pike Pine streetscape improvements, if any?
Sure. So an important aspect of SEPA and what we look at with documents like environmental impact statements is, reasonably foreseeable actions, things that we may not have, a full picture of yet, but they're known to be potential impacts. And as part of this cumulative impacts chapter, we considered, and I'm sorry because there's a lot of names being thrown, but at the time, Pier 58 project was described as the Union Street pier replacement. So we considered that potential project as a reasonably foreseeable action in the cumulative impacts chapter, along with the Pike Pine streetscape improvements.
Was the Alpau FEIS appealed?
Yes, it was appealed by 3 groups, the Alliance for Pioneer Square, the Seattle Historic Waterfront Association, and the Waterfront Landings Association.
Were the appeals connected to any of the LID improvements?
No, not specifically. Those appeals were in 2016 when we were, when we were looking at the final EIS, and the LID process was several years later, in 2019.
What was the result of the appeals?
So the city, ultimately, we were able to reach settlement agreements with each of those organizations, and their appeals were withdrawn. The settlement agreements dealt primarily with a variety of issues related to construction, mitigating the impacts of construction, traffic mitigation, and issues of that sort, which is pretty typical of those types of settlement agreements.
What impact did settlement agreements have on LID improvements, if any?
The interesting thing is the LID was not, a topic of the FEIS. I don't think it actually, I don't recall it mentioning the LID specifically. The one thing in the settlements as they were negotiated that came up was specifically for the Alliance for Pioneer Square. They requested, as part of their settlement, and we agreed, that we would increase the level of investment through the LID in street improvements for Pioneer Square from 12 million, which was the thought at that time, to 20 million, which was contingent on whether we would actually go about forming an LID down the road. But we did make that adjustment as part of that settlement agreement.
Okay. So all my questions I have for you on this exhibit, so I will stop sharing it. So
Before you move on to the next segment, could I ask you to clarify again what ALPAL was? It was Alaska Way. What is that acronym for?
Alaskan Way Promenade and Overlook Walk improvements, or just Alaskan Way Promenade and Overlook Walk.
And what's ALPAL stand for? Because there's clearly not a one-for-one with what you just said and the acronym. What's
Okay, yeah, the acronym is AW, Alaskan Way, P, Promenade, Overlook Walk, OW. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
We're terrible about creating acronyms in government. Apologies.
We see a few of those in our hearing room.
You do.
So I want to ask you some questions, Marshall, about Exhibit 3, which is Ordinance 125761. But given that we're remote, I'm not really directing your attention to any portion of 125761. So in order to let you testify, I'm not planning to share the document. But of course, if I do direct your attention to any actual portion of that exhibit, I'll share it. But I've been looking at my questions and I could tell that they're more general in nature. Can you tell us what Ordinance 125761 topic matter?
Sure. This is the operations and maintenance agreement for the waterfront, which was also approved by the City Council in January of 2019.
And how will the city maintain and ensure the safety of the parks created by the LID improvements?
Sure. So I was alluding to this earlier. A really critical part of our partnership with Friends of Waterfront Seattle, but ultimately also with some of what were priorities for the Waterfront Conservancy and others, is that we had a very strong strategy for how we would maintain, operate, and keep the waterfront safe and attractive. not only on day one, but 10, 15 years down the road. And so what this ordinance did, which is frankly quite unprecedented in the city, is it commits the city parks department to create a dedicated focus on the maintenance of these new parks, which are created, and specifically to dedicate $4.8 million annually, which increases with over time with inflation, to support that effort. And then as in tandem with that, in partnership, the Friends of Waterfront Seattle is dedicating a team which it will fund directly, which provides programming and activation of the waterfront. So the types of the daily kind of high touch personal activities that bring the space to life and engage the community in those spaces, they would directly fund and support. In addition to that, the Friends is also providing direct support for safety and security on the waterfront as well. The other key things that ordinance did is it established a performance standard as the basis for the ongoing quality of both maintenance and programming, based on looking at what are examples of very high quality parks, not only looking at Seattle but looking at other peer cities, and then what are the specific commitments of staff time, resources, specific maintenance activities that have to be done to meet that standard. And so that was described in the ordinance, and actually an oversight committee was created by that ordinance, which brings together a whole group of leaders in the community, especially downtown property owners, Friends of Waterfront Seattle and others, to oversee the maintenance effort and make sure that we live up to that performance standard. Issues like cleanliness, safety, the repair of assets. It also did something unique, which is it brought several city departments directly accountable to that oversight committee for the park's success, which included, obviously, the park superintendent is really critical to that, our office at Waterfront, but also the transportation department, which will be operating Alaskan Way. And we actually also have the city police chief is a direct participant in that oversight committee to really help us have a direct line to deal with any safety, security, social service needs that the waterfront might be having.
If you could remind us, what is the city's level of funding commitment to the maintenance and safety of Waterfront Park?
It is $4.8 million annually, starting in 2023 as the park, is close to completion, and then it escalates over time.
Is the 4.8 million in annual funding guaranteed?
It is in the ordinance. Essentially, the ordinance requires the city to include 4.8 million in baseline funding for the waterfront annually. It is ultimately the city council's action to approve that funding in annual budgets.
If there's a significant economic downturn, what effect could that have on the baseline funding for operations and maintenance pursuant to this ordinance?
Sure. Yeah, especially right now. Very fair question. So the baseline funding is allowed to be reduced in that ordinance. We did, anticipate the possibility of that. What it basically says is that you can reduce the maintenance funding by an equivalent percentage to the reduction in the city's general fund, or 5%, whichever is less.
How will the city monitor security incidents in the eventual waterfront park in the public spaces?
Sure. So again, that ordinance that we're talking about requires the city and the oversight committee to monitor annually security incidents of a variety of sorts on the waterfront and all the parks and public spaces. The oversight committee will be reviewing those reports and very actively engaged. I mentioned the participation of the police chief, the Friends team in troubleshooting that. If for any reason we ever were to see a significant uptick in security, for example, I think the number in the ordinance, I believe, was 10% year over year, so a 10% increase over the previous year. The Oversight Committee has the option to directly lead a comprehensive review of safety and security and to make recommendations directly to the mayor and council on any changes needed.
Are you aware of the, in this proceeding, the sentiment of some objectors that the parks created by the lit improvements will attract additional crime and homelessness?
Yes, I'm aware of that sentiment.
And what is your response?
Well, the city's experience has been that the key thing is for our parks and public spaces to have dedicated, committed staff who do both maintenance, but also the partnerships to create the ability to really activate and provide safety and security in a dedicated way as well. What we've found, and we've talked a lot through our public engagement about our recent experiences with Westlake Park and Occidental Park, neither of which are perfect, but in both cases, the city created dedicated resources, partnered with outside partners to bring both programming and security, that we've been able to significantly improve the condition of those parks and address crime, help respond to people who are struggling with homelessness and the like, and significantly improve the quality of those parks. So we are we're bullish that we can have safe, attractive, well-maintained parks when we have the dedicated resources to do it. And those two spaces are examples of the potential for that.
If the lid didn't exist, how would the promenade, which is one of the 6 lid improvements, how would the promenade be managed?
So part of what the commitments that we've made here to Friends of Waterfront Seattle, and it's also reflected in the commitments made to property owners downtown as part of our protest waiver agreement, is that we will put in place that dedicated set of resources and that whole maintenance and programming regime that I described. That as part of that, the promenade essentially becomes a park space. Today, that promenade is a transportation corridor. If we do not have those things in place, the promenade essentially is, it's like any other sidewalk in the city, and it doesn't have that dedicated team in terms of addressing some of the issues that people have been concerned about.
Let's have a few more questions for you, Marshall.
Sure.
Obviously, we are, and I'm switching gears on you a bit to close out here. I want to talk about the construction schedule for the improvements. Are you familiar generally with the anticipated construction schedule for the 6 improvements?
I am, yeah.
How will the COVID-19, the shutdowns that we've had, the anticipated economic downturn impact the LID construction schedule?
Yeah, so we have actually been able to proceed on schedule through the COVID-19 process. So our office, along with all the capital departments in the city, have worked closely with the governor's office, with the State Department of Health, county public health on safety protocols for essential work. Capital projects like the waterfront were deemed essential projects by the governor very early on in this crisis. And so we have actually stayed on schedule and been able to safely advance our construction through the pandemic.
And in your view, will COVID-19 impact the city's ability to complete the lid improvements by 2024?
So right now, that is our schedule. Based on our current situation, our contractor actually has even been able to accelerate some work because of the lack of traffic in the core area. We do believe we will finish the program, including the LID improvements, in 2024. That said, I'm not obviously I can't predict the future, and 2024 is really not a hard deadline. That is our anticipated completion, based on our construction schedule.
Just two last questions for you. With the lid in place, who will manage the what becomes Waterfront Park? And when I say who, I mean what city department will have responsibility? I believe I may just have missed this in your testimony, but what city department will have responsibility for management?
The primary responsibility will be with the Seattle Parks Department. Again, the partnership with the Friends of Waterfront Seattle that I described before.
Okay. And if if the lid didn't exist, what city department would have primary responsibility for managing that area?
Sure. Without the lid, the Department of Transportation would be the primary department managing. It would manage the most space, including the promenade on the waterfront.
That's all the questions I have for you, Marshall. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Foster.
Mm-hmm.
I think what I'd like to do to try to mimic what we can for a record like we would in a hearing room is to see if we can omit the exhibits that came in with this witness. We may do that with others as well. We'll see how it goes. But there's exhibits 1, 2, and 3 submitted by the city. Are there any objections to exhibits 1, 2, or 3 being admitted? This is to you objectors. I'm asking if you have any objection, procedural, not just argumentative, to exhibits 1, 2, or 3 being admitted. And you don't have to tell me if you do not have an objection. I just need to know if there is an objection. Hearing none, exhibits 1, 2, and 3 are admitted. City?
Thank you. For our second witness, Mark Lukens, Ms. Thompson is going to do the direct examination.
Good morning. Mr. Lukens, are you on the video call?
He says, there he is.
Great.
Luke, you need to unmute yourself.
There we go.
There you go. Do you swear or affirm the testimony we'll provide in today's hearing will be the truth?
I do.
Thank you. Your witness?
Good morning, Mr. Luken. Could you please state and spell your name for the record?
Yes, Mark Lukens, M-A-R-K-L-U-K-E-N-S.
And could you tell us about your educational background?
Sure. I have a BA in hotel administration from Washington State University and an MBA in finance from the University of San Diego.
And what professional licenses do you hold?
I'm a state certified general appraiser in several states, including Washington, and I have the MAI designation from the Appraisal Institute.
And how long have you been a licensed appraiser?
Roughly 28 years, I would say.
And you mentioned the MAI designation. Could you explain what that is?
Sure. It's a member of the Appraisal Institute. So it's a rigorous process to get the designation. It involves taking a number of courses, submitting your work for experience peer review, taking a final comprehensive exam, and doing a demonstration report that is reviewed.
And so does that designation relate then to the appraisal of real property?
Yes.
And how long have you held that designation?
About 30 years now.
And could you tell us what types of properties you have experience appraising?
Sure. All different types of properties, industrial, retail, residential, but my specialty is in hospitality properties.
And when you say hospitality properties, what does that include?
Primarily hotels, but I also do casinos, golf courses, marinas, but mostly hotel properties.
And what would you say is the proportion of appraisals that you've performed for hotels throughout your career?
Probably 90, 95%.
And approximately how many appraisals have you performed of Seattle hotels?
I'd say roughly 30.
And in addition to performing appraisals for Seattle hotels, have you had any experience in reviewing other appraisers' appraisals of Seattle hotels?
Yes. I would say roughly 25 to 30 of those as well.
And setting aside for the moment your experience with appraising hotels in Seattle, what other experience do you have with the Seattle hotel market?
I've done a number of hotel feasibility studies, provided litigation support services to hotel owners in the market. I was a hotel broker for about 5 years, so researched hotel owners in the market, and also did development and acquisitions work for Wyndham and Cambria hotels. So I looked at development sites throughout downtown Seattle, as well as redevelopment opportunities, and also acquisitions of existing hotels.
And where are you currently employed?
With LW Hospitality Advisors.
And what does LW Hospitality Advisors do?
We provide real estate consulting services to the hospitality industry. So again, hotels, resorts, conference centers, casinos.
And what do you do there, you specifically?
So I'm a managing director. I head up the Western U.S. operations for LWHA. And that involves building business development, supervising staff, reviewing reports, and also I execute a fair number of engagements myself and provide litigation support services.
And where is LW Hospitality Advisors located?
We have offices throughout the country, including San Diego, Seattle. Our head office is in New York.
And how long have you been employed there?
About 5 years now.
Could you tell us about what you did before you came to your current position?
Sure. Most recently, I was a hotel broker, as I mentioned, and consultant. I kind of split my time between those two, based in Seattle. So I sold hotels, did feasibility studies, appraisals for hotels. And then prior to that, I did acquisitions and development for Wyndham and Starwood and Cambria hotels.
And I'll have you take a look at what's been marked as Exhibit C4.
Okay.
And when you have that pulled up, could you identify what this exhibit is?
Yes, it's my qualifications.
And shifting gears a little bit to this proceeding, are you familiar with the Seattle Waterfront Local Improvement District?
Yes.
And what's your understanding of the local improvement district?
It was established by the Seattle City Council to fund various improvements along the waterfront and city streets. And they hired ABS valuation to assess the increase in value that would result as a result of those improvements.
And were you involved in ABS valuations work for the LID?
Yes, I was brought in to assist with the hotel portion of their analysis.
And when were you hired by ABS?
April of last year, so April of 2019.
And in your work with ABS, who were you primarily working with?
I worked with Bob McCauley and Paul Bird.
And what were you hired to do for ABS?
I was hired to assist with the hotel valuation, provide input on various parameters, look at the overall reasonableness of the analysis, and provide input on format, etc.
Sure. Could you just walk us through the work that you did for ABS? What did you do first?
First, I reviewed their preliminary benefit study. I reviewed the HRNA study, and I did some research on comparable markets that had similar improvements.
And after you reviewed those materials, what did you do next?
Provided information and data to ABS, information on current hotel market conditions, operating expense ratios, comparable sales in the market.
And what were the sources of that information?
Variety of sources for the market data. SDR does a lot of research. HVS does market reports. Kidder Matthews actually publishes a periodic hotel market update. The Host study, Real Capital Analytics, various industry publications, business journals, as well as just my general involvement in the market. I co-founded a group called the Northwest Hotel Investment Forum that meets twice a year and provides updates on hotel market conditions. And I present at each meeting about current market conditions and recent transactions in the market.
So you mentioned HVS. What does that stand for?
Hospitality Valuation Services. They're another national hotel consulting valuation firm.
And what kind of information do they provide about Seattle hotels?
They do periodic market research reports, so report on what's going on in the market. I don't actually recall whether they had a specific study for the Seattle market, but they do periodically put out studies on individual markets. But they provide information on hotel values and cap rates and that kind of stuff.
And you also mentioned a host report. Could you just describe what that is and what type of information is in that?
Sure. It's published annually by STR, and it's they gather financial statements from thousands of hotels across the country, and then they report composite results for different categories, such as large hotels, smaller hotels, full service versus limited service, various geographic areas. So Pacific is one of the regions they report on, as well as like the mountain area and East Coast. And then they report averages like expense ratios and amounts per available room. So you can kind of benchmark a hotel against those ratios, those results and ratios.
And you also mentioned the Kidder-Matthews reports. Could you tell us what type of information is contained in those reports?
Yes, they publish, I don't know if they do it on a regular basis, but on a periodic basis, reports on, I think it's the greater Puget Sound market. So they compile data from STR for occupancy and average rates, and then they present data on sales and new construction, et cetera.
And did that include data and information about the Seattle hotel market?
Yes, generally they do, yeah.
And you also mentioned Real Capital Analytics. Could you explain what that is?
Sure. It's a national, well, actually international, I believe, source for information on commercial real estate. So they report on property sales, refinancings, general trends in the market, investment trends, as well as cap rate information. And they don't focus on hotels, but they have information on hotels.
Okay, so it sounds like you reviewed some background materials and gathered information and provided it to ABS. What did you do next in your work with ABS?
At that point, I believe I reviewed their individual spreadsheets for each of the properties.
Okay, and I'm gonna have you take a look at what's been marked as Exhibit C5.
Okay.
And just let me know when you've got that pulled up.
Okay, I've got it here.
Okay, could you identify what Exhibit C5 is?
Yes, it's an ABS valuation spreadsheet for the Sound Hotel and Arrive Apartments.
And is this spreadsheet representative of the spreadsheets that ABS prepared for the hotel properties and that you reviewed?
Yes.
And taking a look at this Sound Hotel spreadsheet, could you describe for us the type of information that you provided feedback on?
Sure. Well, again, I provided them information on the host report, so that helped them with some of the expense margins. I provided input on formatting, for example. There's a uniform system of accounts for hotels that just kind of sets forth a standard format for hotel operating statements. So gave them information on how those were set up in terms of having the revenues, departmental expenses, undistributed expenses, fixed expenses. So I looked at that, gave them some suggestions on formatting, and again, provided them information on general averages, provided some input on occupancies and average rates. But mainly I was focused on the overall values and price per room.
And did you review ABS's final value conclusions for the hotel properties?
Yes.
And what conclusions did you draw regarding those current market values?
I felt they were reasonable.
And why do you say that?
They were in line with recent comparable sales in the market. Seattle has been a highly desirable market for hotel investors, developers, owners. So the concluded values were well in line with what people were paying for similar properties in the market.
And what's the significance of comparable sales when evaluating whether an estimated hotel value is reasonable?
They kind of set a benchmark for what other people are paying in the market. Yeah, and they provide a good comparable for what a similar hotel would be worth.
And have you had an opportunity to read the appraisals that Mr. Gordon issued for the 11 hotel properties in this proceeding?
I looked through them, yes.
And at this point, I'll have you take a look at what's been marked as Exhibit C, Exhibit C6.
Okay.
And when you've got it before you, could you describe what Exhibit C6 is?
Yes, that's a table of recent 3-4-star hotel sales in the Seattle market.
And who prepared this table?
I did.
And are the hotels in this table comparable to the hotels that Mr. Gordon appraised in this proceeding?
Yes, and some of them are, like the Alexis is one that he appraised.
And could you tell us, could you just walk us through this table in terms of what it's showing? You have some footnotes in here. Could you explain what those footnotes mean and the highlighting?
Sure. So a couple of these sales, so the highlighted ones were part of portfolio transactions. So the Homewood Suites Convention Center and the Paramount Hotel, meaning that they sold with at least one other property. So generally those, you don't put as much reliance on those sales because sometimes the allocations, they may pay a certain price for 4 properties, but then the allocations may not be specific to that property. So you just need to kind of take those with a grain of salt. So I didn't include those in the averages. And then the footnotes are, so the Hotel Sorrento was actually the sale of the lease fee interest. So I noted that. And then with the Hilton, the seller there had bifurcated the property. So they had sold the parking garage separately from the hotel. So obviously that reduced the value. So I footnoted that.
And so for the Hotel Sorrento and the Hilton Hotel, are those sale values included in the average that you have at the bottom?
No, I didn't include those in the averages because they were not really comparable.
And that's because
they're presented really just for information.
Okay, and they're not comparable. You don't consider them to be comparable because they either involve just the sale of a leasehold interest or didn't involve the sale of the parking structure in the case of the Hilton.
Yes.
And could you just tell us, excluding those properties, what were the average price per room for the 4-star properties that you looked at?
The average for those properties was roughly $673,000.
And for the 3-star properties?
That was roughly $419,000.
And next, I'm going to have you take a look at Exhibit C7.
Okay.
And are you familiar with this exhibit?
Yes.
What is it?
It's an exhibit put together by, I believe it was John Gordon at Kidder Matthews.
And what is this exhibit displaying?
It's also a list of comparable sales in the Seattle market.
And what's your impression of Mr. Gordon's comparable sales list?
Well, he left off some sales like the Alexis, the Homewood Suites, the Paramount, and then he didn't do any indication on the Sorrento Hotel and the Hilton that they weren't full property sales.
And so what's the effect of not footnoting information like that?
It doesn't really tell the whole picture of the transaction, so it's not really comparable.
And next, I'm going to have you pull up Exhibit C8.
Okay.
And could you tell us what this exhibit is?
Yes, it's a comparison of the Kidder Matthews values for these, I believe there's 11 hotels, and then the ABS valuation values.
And what does the per room column represent?
That's the concluded value divided by the number of rooms. So the price per room, that's a common comparison for hotel sales.
And you also have a column that's entitled Recent Refinance or Transaction and Comments. What type of information do you have in that column?
Well, in the case of the Alexis, it actually sold in March of 2017 to a very experienced buyer owner for $71.6 million, and they subsequently invested $14 million in a renovation. So their basis in that property was 85.6 million. The other three are refinance transactions that took place in May of 2017. So when they refinance, they get an appraisal. So those are what the appraised values were at that time. They weren't sale transactions, but refinances.
And can you tell us, looking at that refinance information and comparing it to the Kidder Matthews valuations that were performed more recently, how do the 2017 appraised values compare to Kidder Matthews appraised values?
They're all substantially higher.
The refinance is higher.
The appraisals that were done for the refinance are higher, yes.
And going back to the Alexis, so your table here says that the Alexis was sold in 2017 for $71,600,000. And what does Kidder Matthews value that same hotel at for today?
They valued it at 66 million. But then, as I noted before, they also invested another 14 million in it after they bought it.
So looking here at the bottom of the table, you have a line that says average of comparable 4-star sales. Mm-hmm. And so is that number what you derived from from Exhibit C6?
Yes.
And looking at that average sale price per room, how does Kidder Matthews valuations line up with that?
They're all substantially below that.
And
some less than half that.
And a similar question, but with respect to the ABS values, how do ABS's values line up in terms of the average comparable sales?
They're also a bit lower in most cases, except for the Thompson Hotel, but generally more in line with the average of the comparable sales.
So based on your review of Mr. Gordon's appraisals and also your experience with the Seattle hotel market, what's your overall impression of Mr. Gordon's concluded values for the hotel properties?
They appear conservative to me.
Okay, so shifting gears a little bit, I'd like to talk about what an appraiser includes in the current market value of a hotel property. When appraising a hotel property, is personal property included in the current market value of the property?
Yes, in almost all cases, yes.
And if an appraiser did not include personal property in the current market value, what effect would that have on the value of the property overall?
It would understate the value.
And in your work with ABS, what is your understanding of whether ABS included personal property in the current market value calculations?
It's my understanding they did include it.
And have you had an opportunity to review the comparison tables that Mr. Gordon submitted with his testimony in this proceeding?
Yes.
And I'm going to have you turn to Exhibit C9.
Okay.
Is this an example of one of Mr. Gordon's comparison tables?
Yes.
And which property does this refer to?
This is for the Grand Hyatt.
And what's your understanding of what this table is portraying?
Well, there's several columns, so they have the actual results, actual reported results from the hotel for 2018, the ABS preliminary values, ABS final values, and then the Kidder Matthews stabilized value.
And I'd like you to look at the line in this table for current value. And
Okay.
could you tell me in the Kidder Matthews column whether the current value figure they have stated there includes personal property?
The 168,400,000.
Yes.
I believe that excludes personal property.
And how do you know that?
Because I also looked through their appraisal or their restricted appraisal of that property.
So let's take a look at that now. This has been marked as Exhibit C10.
Okay.
And is Exhibit C10 a copy of the Kidder Matthews appraisal for the Grand Hyatt?
Yes.
And so I'll have you turn to page 2 of C10. And
Okay.
could you read the final paragraph?
Yes. It says, in our opinion, the current market value of the Grand Hyatt Hotel as of January 1st, 2020 is $175,300,000 with $168,400,000 for the real estate and $6,900,000 for the personal property.
So does that confirm your conclusion that the comparison table does not include the value of personal property in the current value that's listed for Kidder Matthews?
Yes.
So in your opinion, does the comparison table provide a complete picture of the current market value for that property?
No.
And why is that?
Because it excludes the personal property.
And shifting gears a little, I'd like to talk about ABS valuations analysis of the hotel properties.
Okay.
What method did ABS use in arriving at the current market value for the hotel properties?
They primarily relied on the income approach to value, but then they also considered comparable sales.
And what does the income approach to value involve?
It involves putting together either a one-year forecast of income and expenses or a discounted cash flow. In the case of what ABS did, they did just a 1-year projection of cash flow. So it involves estimating revenues for all the hotel facilities, which may include food and beverage, parking, retail, and then the departmental expenses, undistributed expenses, and deducting fixed expenses to get to a net operating income.
And so all of those pieces of information that go into developing a net operating income, where does an appraiser usually get that information?
Usually you would get it from the hotel owner, the hotel itself.
And do you know whether ABS valuation had access to that information from the hotel owners?
I understand they did not have access to that information.
And so if you're an appraiser and you're tasked with determining the current market value for a hotel property, but you don't have access to the hotel's historic data, how do you go about coming to a current value conclusion?
You would look at general market trends for hotel occupancy average rate, adjust it to that facility. You could do research on what their asking rates are, which are typically quite a bit higher than the average rate. You would look at what occupancies of similar hotels are doing. You would turn to sources like the host report to look at expense margins. You could determine top property taxes by looking at comparable properties. So you would just gather information from various sources, market data, comparable properties, et cetera.
And is it your understanding that ABS undertook those steps in their valuation of the hotel properties?
Yes.
And earlier you mentioned that you did research of comparable markets as part of your work with ABS.
Yes.
Which markets did you research?
Specifically, I reached out to hotel managers in Manhattan and in Boston.
And why did you select those markets?
Because they seemed most similar in terms of the improvements that were going to be done in terms of the park improvements.
And what was the purpose of reaching out to those hotel operators?
Well, I looked at specifically hotels that were in close proximity to those. It was the High Line Park in New York, and then the Rose Kennedy Greenway in Boston. So I looked at hotels that were in relative close proximity to them because I wanted to get a sense for whether or not they felt that they benefited from being close to those facilities.
And what did you conclude from your research?
That they did say that they felt they benefited from the facilities in terms of increased visitation, which led to higher occupancies and room rates, and also ancillary facilities like their food and beverage outlets.
And you also mentioned that you had reviewed the HRNA economic study. What did you conclude from your review of that study?
That they projected increased visitation to the market as a result of these improvements.
And what effect does increased visitation have on hotel property values?
Well, increased visitation would lead to more people coming to the market, so more people looking for hotel accommodations. So it would result in higher revenues for the hotels, either in occupancy or average rate, or potentially both, and also for their ancillary facilities like food and beverage.
And that increased visitation, is that limited to the tourist sector?
Yeah, I believe it's predominantly for the tourist sector. I mean, I think the hotels would benefit in other ways, but in terms of the study itself, I think it was focused primarily on just increased visitation to the city.
In your experience, what other ways would hotels benefit from the improvements?
Well, besides the increase in leisure traveler, you have commercial travelers, which are essentially business travelers, and it's not necessarily going to result in more business travel to the market, but people looking to stay within the market would look, at what's surrounding the hotel. And particularly now, a lot of business travelers are extending their stay. So what's around the hotel, getting a sense for the local environment is important to at least some business travelers. And then on the group side, a group meeting planner coming to downtown Seattle would also look at the hotel and say, okay, what does this hotel offer that maybe some of these other ones don't? So they, proximity to the convention center, if they're there, is very important, but all other things being equal, if they're close to an amenity like these park-like improvements, that would be a factor in their decision whether or not to choose a particular hotel.
So in your opinion, do the proposed LID improvements support an increase in property value for the hotels in the LID boundary?
Yes.
And why is that?
Because it'll increase visitation to the area, and particularly to those properties that will benefit, and that'll result in increased revenues, which flow to the bottom line, which will lead to an increase in values.
Okay, I'm going to have you look now at Exhibit C11.
Okay.
And could you describe for me what Exhibit C11 is?
It is a declaration of John Gordon, dated May 29th, 1920.
And have you had a chance to review this declaration?
Yes, I have.
So I'll have you turn to page 3 of Exhibit C11.
Okay.
And looking at paragraph 9, Mr. Gordon states that there is no hard data to support your statement that the LID improvements will increase occupancy and or room rates at hotels near the LID improvements. What's your response to that?
Well, the HRNA study did indicate that there would be increased visitation to the market, as well as my conversations with hotel managers in New York and Boston in close proximity. They said that they did see an increase in visitation and revenues. But also, an appraiser doesn't always have hard data to work with. Some of it comes down to reasoning just based on experience.
And so on the next page, page 4 of Exhibit C11, paragraph 10, Mr. Gordon makes a similar statement about your opinion that the LID improvements will increase net income, which will lead to higher property values for hotels. What's your response to that?
Well, similarly, it the increased revenues resulting from increased visitation from indicated in the HRNA study, and my conversations with managers in other markets and just general knowledge. If you have the increased revenues, it's going to lead to increased values because your net operating income is going to be higher.
And as you testified before, the net operating income is part of the calculation to derive the market value of a hotel. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah, it's one of the key variables.
Okay, so did you have a chance to review or to read Mr. Gordon's appraisal of the Sound Hotel?
Yes.
And what's your opinion of Mr. Gordon's current market value for the Sound Hotel?
Let me just pull up that. It appears very conservative.
And what do you mean by that? Or why do you say that?
It's likely well below their construction costs. And just based on the comparable sales.
So I'm going to have you look at Exhibit C12.
Okay.
And when you've got it pulled up, could you identify this exhibit?
This is also a declaration of John Gordon. This is dated May 7th, 2020.
And if you could turn to page 3.
Okay.
And looking at paragraph 8, Mr. Gordon says that he says, I know of no instance in which an operating hotel was purchased based on its development cost. As acknowledged in Mr. Lucan's declaration, hotel investors base their offering prices on projected income. The sunk cost of construction is irrelevant. What's your response to that?
Well, a couple things. One, a market value assumes willing buyer and a willing seller. So somebody who just spent, $500,000 a key or, whatever, 70 million on a property, they're not going to turn around and sell that for less than their invested capital in it, unless they're under duress, which is not part of the definition of market value. It assumes a willing seller. But also, people looking to get into the market, their choice, and as I said before, it was a highly desirable market for buyers. They're going to look at, how can I get into the market? I can either build or I can buy an existing hotel. So for them, the construction cost is highly relevant.
And I just have a few more questions here. Have you been following the impacts of COVID-19 on the Seattle hotel market?
Yes.
And could you describe what those impacts have been?
Yes, it's been devastating to particularly the downtown Seattle market.
And in what sense has it devastated that market?
Occupancies are, many hotels are closed and occupancies are down in the, teens or single digits in some cases.
In your opinion, what impact should COVID-19 have on ABS's final benefit study?
Since the data value was October 1, 2019, it shouldn't have any impact.
And could you describe for us what the purpose of a data value is in an appraisal?
Sure, it sets the frame of reference and like a benchmark for what investors would have known as of that date. And it assumes a sale as of that date. So whatever an investor would have known as of that date.
And why is it important to set a date of value?
Otherwise, it could be constantly changing. And again, it's a reference point of what would a buyer have known as of this date. If there's general knowledge of something as of that date, so like if a Super Bowl were coming to the market or the Olympics or something like that, people would have known about it and they would have factored that into their purchase decision. On the downside, if a major company was leaving the market and that was general knowledge, then they would factor that in. But it sets like a placeholder for this is the date of the information, what people would have known as of this date.
Thank you, Mr. Lukens. I don't have any further questions.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lukens. Let's look at the exhibits that have been submitted during Mr. Lukens' testimony. Those are exhibits 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. Are there any objections to any of those exhibits being admitted at this time? Are there any objections to exhibits 4 through 12 submitted by the city being admitted? Exhibits 4 through 12 are admitted. Back to the city.
Thank you. Our next witness is going to be Robert McCauley. I don't know if your preference at this point would be to take a break now for lunch or to start Mr. McCauley's testimony and then break at a, past noon.
Because the Seattle channel is broadcasting, we have less flexibility than I normally would in a hearing, which does flow, the breaks match where the witnesses are. But because they will be broadcasting up till noon, we'll want to go through noon and then take a break for lunch at that time.
Okay, no problem. I'm going to turn it back over to Mr. Filippini.
Right back, just have to address a technical issue.
This is Megan from Perkins. I'll also just note that some of the exhibits that I have not been able to open are from the Macaulay folder, and those include C13, C14, and C15, which are the first 3 exhibits. And I think I can actually access them elsewhere, but or find them, but I am not able to access those 3 from the folder.
And Ms. Lynn, that was 13, 14, and 15, correct?
Correct. And if you want to know, the other 2 are 18 and 22 that I was unable to open.
Okay.
And this is Mr. Moses. As you change exhibits, if you could just give like 30 seconds pause before you begin questioning on an exhibit, because for those of us who are working off the OneNote piece, we've got to get into OneNote, re-download the next exhibit, and by the time we get there, we're halfway through it. So if you could just take a little break there, it would be beneficial for us.
All right, I'll ask the city to give a bit of a cadence there and slow as they change, maybe not a full half minute, but if you could just take your time to make sure that the exhibit can be accessed by the objectors, recognizing the limits of the technology, that would be appreciated. We will use share screen for exhibits 13, 14, 15, 18, and 22. And Mr. McCauley, please state your name and spell it for the record.
Yes, Robert McCauley, MacAullay.
And you swear or affirm the testimony you provide in today's hearing will be the truth?
I do.
Your witness, Mr. Filippini?
Thank you. Mr. McCauley, where are you currently employed?
I'm currently employed at ABS Valuation.
And what does ABS Valuation do?
We're a full-service commercial real estate appraisal firm.
Does ABS have any prior names?
Yes. When I first started in the business, I was McCauley and Associates for many years, approximately 25 years. And then I merged with what was then Valbridge Property Advisors. And subsequent to being with Valbridge Property Advisors for a number of years, then we turned our name into ABS Valuation.
Okay. Where are your office locations?
We're located in Seattle, Bothell, Fircrest, Tacoma area, and Everett.
What services does ABS Valuation provide?
We provide a broad range of real estate appraisal services, variety of commercial properties, industrial, office, retail, for many different entities, corporations, banks. We do a lot of government work, right-of-way work, obviously special benefit study work that I specialize in.
How many employees does ABS Valuation have?
Typically between about 25 and 30.
What is your title with ABS Valuation?
I am a principal.
What are your responsibilities as principal?
Overall, seeing the business, management, appraisal review, conducting appraisals on my own.
And how long have you been at ABS?
Approximately 5 years. We've been merged with ABS.
I want to ask you just briefly about some of your prior jobs. Before you came to the entity that is now ABS, what was your immediately prior job?
Prior to getting into the appraisal industry, I worked for what was then Weyerhaeuser Mortgage in Los Angeles for several years, and doing underwriting and secondary market analysis. After that, I moved back to the Seattle area and worked for what was then Schuler, McCowan, and Keenan. And they were a fairly large commercial appraisal firm down on First and Cherry in Seattle, and worked for them for about 3 years. And then my father had been in the appraisal industry since the 60s. And so I moved up to Everett, where the office is located, and started working for my father, and then took over management of that business in the late 80s.
And that business is now today ABS Valuation?
That's correct.
Okay. What is your total experience as an appraiser?
Over 30 years.
What states, where have you done projects?
Primarily in Washington, but also worked in California, Oregon, and Montana.
How did you first become involved with special benefit work?
It dated back to the late 80s. My father got involved in it in the late 70s, when the proportionality issue kind of came to fruition, and he worked on a large LID in the Redmond area, which is now part of the Microsoft campus, and that was the kind of the basis for when I got into the appraisal business, in learning the current way that and methodology that we do special benefit studies.
Okay, so I guess approximately when did your personal experience begin with conducting special benefit studies in Washington?
My personal experience would have started in the late 80s, 1988 or so.
If you could describe for us other local improvement districts that you've worked on that are similar to this project.
We've done a wide variety of LIDs over the years. Other large LIDs we've done. We did 2 large LIDs for the city of Ocean Shores that entailed about 10,000 to 13,000 properties. One was a wastewater sewer installation LID that covered most of the city. And we also did a road improvement LID, which provided a new upgraded road system throughout the city. And that covered the whole city, including the commercial area. The sewer LID was mainly related to the residential portion of the city. Other similar projects we did, I think it was around 2012, we did a feasibility study for the city of Vancouver, Washington. They were looking at a large 35-acre mixed-use development down along the Columbia River. And it was predicated on a 7-acre park and a pier that would have needed to be constructed in order for this 35 acres to develop. The 35 acres would have brought in, I think it was 2,000 or better condo units and a million square feet of office and associated retail and restaurant development. Subsequent to the feasibility study, developers self-financed that project, so an LID was never done.
And then let me ask about how many LIDs have you done in Washington?
Over 100.
And how long, in terms of approximately how many years have you done special benefit work?
Most of my appraisal career, so approximately 30 years.
How many of these, I think you already answered me, but how many of the over 100 that you said of the LIDs you worked on were in Washington?
All of them.
Please describe for us any prior LID work that you've done for the city of Seattle.
We did a feasibility study and a draft formation special benefit study in Capitol Hill for a streetcar extension project. And that involved about 1,800 or more properties. And I think that was done around 2015.
Okay. And you mentioned feasibility study. Why not? Did the project progress?
Subsequent to doing the feasibility study and after drafting the special benefit formation study, they just due to internal budgeting issues and whatnot, they decided to not move forward with the project.
Okay, and they's the city of Seattle.
That's correct.
What professional licenses do you hold?
I have the MAI designation, and I'm also a state certified general appraiser.
Okay, and I'm going to ask you first about your state certification. How long have you held the state certified general appraiser designation?
Since 1992.
And when you say state of Washington?
State of Washington, correct.
And then you mentioned an MAI designation. I'll ask you first, what is MAI?
It's a member of the Appraisal Institute.
And what's the Appraisal Institute?
It's a professional organization of appraisers.
And how does a person become a member of the Appraisal Institute?
It's a long process of taking a number of courses. You have the demonstration, report, peer review. You have to pass a comprehensive exam. So it typically takes a number of years to obtain.
How long have you been a member of the Appraisal Institute?
Since 1995.
And I don't believe I asked you already, but what's your educational background?
I have a bachelor's degree in economics from Washington State.
What year did you get your degree?
1983.
And I'm going to, and I'll put this up on the screen for folks. I'm going to share what has been marked as Exhibit C13 for those at home, but I will also share it. And Bob, if you could tell us what, do you recognize this document?
Yes.
Okay, and what is it?
That is my qualifications.
Okay. Is this current?
Yes.
And then if you could walk us through it, what it contains. And let me ask you, since I'm controlling the document, what's on page 1?
It's a summary of my education. Just recognize that I've maintained my seminars and continuing education and professional affiliations, my appraisal experience, and discusses my specialty, which is special benefits studies. And so it's more geared towards the latter part of the qualifications.
Okay.
Mr. Philbini.
And then on pages 2,
Mr. Philbini.
and I'm going to scroll for the folks at home because this continues. Pages 2, 3.
Mr. Philbini, I'm ending the hearing. We're going to take a break for lunch now. You're not able to hear me. I'm sorry you're not able to hear me, but we're going to.
This is starting at, sorry.
We're breaking for lunch now. I'm not sure if Mr. Philbini and Mr. Milkelly can hear me, but we are taking a break. It's the noon time now. Thank you. All right, great.